Okay, I've just seen a link from the South China Morning Post, and it's about a young man, an activist by the name of Chen Shi, 34 years old. He's a citizen journalist and activist. He was covering the Hong Kong protests last year, and he's now disappeared. He was reporting on some of the conditions of people in Wuhan and some of the response of the government there to the coronavirus. And he's just disappeared. That should be very concerning. Um, I'll try and put a video link if I can. Sometimes Facebook links are hard to put in the YouTube links, but I'll try if I can to put some sort of link here to raise awareness of this case. Not necessarily to have anything done because it's difficult, but just to remind people of what this regime is all about. Um, Last week, of course, there was a lot of attention around Dr. Li Wenliang. Um, Apologies by the way if I'm pronouncing names wrong, but he's also only 34 years old, young doctor who first warned of this virus in Wuhan, and he told the authorities their attitude was basically to tell him to stop being a troublemaker, stop spreading rumors, and they made threats against him. Well, he succumbed to the virus and he passed away last week. Um, and the regime accepted they were wrong, more or less, but only, well, they didn't really. I mean, they never do. They apparently apologized to him, but only after this thing had really taken root and become a pandemic. Those are just two examples. These two brave young men, Dr. Lee and this journalist Chen Shi, they're not alone. There are other brave Chinese citizens out there. That's why xenophobia, genuine xenophobia, that is, racism against the Chinese people, is a foolish thing because it ignores the fact that there are ordinary Chinese citizens who do stand up to the regime. They may be a minority, but they deserve respect. Um, and I actually tested the ground a little bit. I wrote on my QQ account, RIP Dr. Li Wenliang, a brave man who told the truth. I didn't mention the CCP because I don't want to get my account suspended, but I got a lot of likes for that. It resonated with people, and I think that what's happening in Chinese society right now is possibly the first significant domestic test that Xi Jinping has faced. I mean, up to now, he has had pretty much an unquestioned rise of support. The 70th anniversary events last year, there were Chinese flags everywhere. That was also in response to the situation in Hong Kong. But a big part of that was also based on Xi's growing personality cult. I don't think it'll ever reach the levels that Mao had on the grounds that the Chinese people are genuinely more informed today than they were then. There is a larger middle class. People think more today than they did then. So there are differences. Nevertheless, it remains true that the communist regime controls every aspect of life in China. And you can already see some of the social implications of this virus. Yesterday, Liu Xiaoming, the ambassador, Chinese ambassador to London, he's become quite a prominent figure here because of his statements on the Hong Kong situation, and things got pretty tense last year when he was recalled to the Foreign Office after his verbal attack on Jeremy Hunt. Um, he has come out and denounced the racism of the British government or the British side. Now, this may be in response to the fact there have been a small number of reported racial incidents. My response to that is that's wrong. No Chinese national should be bullied or targeted just because of their nationality. That's ridiculous. That would be like targeting all Americans because of, I don't know, Trump or gun issues or whatever. You can't target someone because of their nationality in of itself. But I would also say there may be more context to some of those situations. I mean, this idea of just racist Westerners targeting the Chinese, I think, may be too simplistic. I think there may be other aspects to it. There's one video that's doing the rounds right now, a young guy, who, in my opinion, is on the other end of the moral spectrum. He is not brave. He is a rabble rouser. This guy is complaining about, oh, biased Westerners. Anyway, his whole narrative was when H5N1 began in the United States, well, point one, that's factually wrong. It didn't. It was actually first declared a pandemic when it was in Mexico. So it was never, that's the reason it was never called the American virus. Because his whole pitch with his video was to say there's double standards because this thing's being called the China virus. Actually, most of the sources I see are calling it the novel coronavirus or the Wuhan virus. I haven't seen many people call it the China virus. That hasn't really entered the vernacular yet. So this video is going all over Chinese social media. It's the same old thing. All biased Westerners picking on us poor Chinese. Um, Racism is wrong, obviously, genuine racism. But the pitch he's taking is nonsense. If you come across this video, he's saying some outright um, factually incorrect statements. I mean, he says something about your prime minister, so he seems a bit confused. He's criticizing America, then he talks about a prime minister. So what is he picking on the UK or America? Or what? Anyway, videos like that, that are spreading false information and then get lapped up by people, they're dangerous because that then a friend of mine, close friend of mine, recently sent me a message that took me aback. She said, Nathan, what do you think of the world versus China right now? Here's the thing though, it's not the world versus China. It's it's barely even the world versus the Chinese government. But what is the situation is that this has opened up you know, a spotlight on Chinese authoritarianism. It was Chinese authoritarianism that enabled this thing to spread the way it did, because for a range of reasons, but one of them is because in a situation like this, every resource of the state is focused on dealing with the crisis. Now, I don't begrudge the Chinese government taking action. They have to. Any government would have to do that. But the fact they basically ignored Dr. Lee because of their arrogance just demonstrates how they've sunk into their own trap in a sense. It's almost like the sheer power of the Chinese Communist Party is its own Achilles heel, ironically. Because all the focus on this means they cannot focus on other things. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I'd be surprised if this doesn't have serious economic effects because the country is basically in lockdown. Banks, schools are all shut down. Now, you could say that's sensible precaution, but that's going to have serious economic effects. Also, there's going to be, I think, growing anger, certainly over the treatment of Dr. Lee. Even the Chinese Communist Party couldn't hide that one, which is somewhat surprising because they're usually so adept at censoring things. But on this occasion, I don't know, how it somehow leaked out on the Chinese social media, and people know about this and they're genuinely angry. I think a lot of Chinese citizens are now angry with the government because they feel that they've been lied to. There will always be that kind of defensive nationalism when it comes to a lot of Chinese attitudes because I think it comes down to a face issue. So they can deal with them criticizing the Chinese government, but if a Westerner does it, oh well, our government's making China look bad, so we better defend it. I honestly think there's that mentality at play as well. Um, but here's the thing: for the Chinese government to be turning around and blaming outsiders or saying they shouldn't overreact is crazy because it's also profoundly hypocritical and arrogant. Because if, let's say, there was some virus that began in Britain or another country and it got into China, the Chinese government would be taking hardline measures. They can hardly be saying to other governments, oh, don't overreact, don't take measures. Every government has the responsibility to protect its citizens. If that means, for example, putting people in quarantine, I support that. I've huge sympathy for those people. You know, it's going to mean temporary inconvenience. It's going to mean it's going to be uncomfortable. But provided they're given the amenities, showers, food, etc., it's a necessary step. Um, really is because we've seen how deadly pandemics can be with the Spanish influenza. But that actually is relevant because this guy in the video who's talking about, oh, why is other pandemics not named after the source? Well, they are. Spanish flu was so named Spanish flu because it was first diagnosed as a pandemic whilst American troops were going in transit through Spain, returning from the front in the First World War. I guess it would have been the Italian front in that case. Um, so that's a good example of how there's a dangerous combination of Chinese supersensitivity with nationalism. And it's dangerous because so often it's based on communist promoted lies. And a lot of people lap it up. I mean, there is no scope for different opinions on Chinese social media. I know because, like I said, I've got a QQ account, I've got a Weibo account. Um, some of the things I'm not against, for example, one thing that's going viral right now is kind of a motivational thing. Wuhan stay strong, the spirit of Wuhan rising. So I'm all for that. You know, any morale boosting is a good thing. Because Wuhan's been described as being in wartime conditions, and this was a city that saw two of the bloodiest battles of the Second Sino-Japanese War. So it's a city that has experienced real hardship in the past. Um, but for me, there's a lot of things that open up with this. The rest of the world is actually now feeling the impact of Chinese totalitarianism. So the Chinese officials like Liu Xiaoming can bark as much as they want, but frankly, I think we're in the trap in this country. And this may be for another video, but I'm just going to put them into the one video for convenience sake. And our trap is this: we have allowed ourselves, frankly, to be too deeply ingrained in kowtowing to China. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I'll give three examples. The presence of CGTN, the fact that CGTN, the state network, a network that has aired false confessions, including of the British journalist Peter Humphreys. You know, the Chinese authorities harshly interrogated him on trumped up charges. He had to make a forced confession. He still suffers PTSD from that. CGTN aired that forced confession. CGTN gets to operate in the UK. I think that's perverse. I'm currently trying to get CGTN, I'm trying to put pressure on Ofcom to get CGTN's license stripped. And I'll put the link under here. I'm aware that these things take time, but please sign it if you agree with what I'm saying. So, that's one thing, the fact that CGTN's operating. Now, okay, maybe most people in Britain don't watch it, but that isn't the point. They shouldn't be allowed a platform in this country when they aired a forced confession of one of our citizens. Point one. Point two, Huawei. Again, Liu Xiaoming made assurances that they're not going to try and sabotage. I mean, it's almost laughable that a senior Chinese official would make that claim. He's lying through his teeth. Of course he is. He's a communist official. They are Olympic gold medalists when it comes to lies. And I think they're so used to lying that they almost believe it themselves. I mean, here's the thing: Huawei, as a Chinese company, whatever assurances they make, it makes no difference because they have to answer to the regime. They have to. So if one day Beijing decided, well, this will be a useful asset, Huawei would have no choice. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes the Johnson administration has made. And I very, very rarely agree with Trump and his administration, but on this one, I think they're right. I think they're right to take a hard line on this. Apparently, Trump was livid. Well, for once, I think he's right because this doesn't only compromise British security, this could compromise the security of our allies because we obviously have close ties to them. It could even affect the Five Eyes partnership, and that is an absolute travesty that we have compromised that for the sake of doing business with Beijing. I mean, Johnson said there is no other option with 5G, but is that really, should that be the final conclusion? And the government even said, oh, but we're not letting them get to the core elements. I don't know the technology of this. I can't say how that would work, but I mean, surely that's not a concrete guarantee. Just because this is a outer core or whatever it is that's described that way, just because we're not giving Huawei access to military compounds or other sensitive sites, the point is they will be operating in the UK. All it will take is one, moment of naivety or recklessness. A minister leaving his phone on a train. You can imagine the situation. Um, I really think it's reckless, and I think that's a serious mistake the Johnson administration made. And if we do have a major cyber attack and it's traced to China, it can be directly put on this. That's the second point. Third point, our universities are shamefully pandering and kowtowing to China in the most pathetic way because they want Chinese investment. You look at any major British university, you look at their China program, they're glowing with boasts about we're investing millions in our partnership with China, etc. Again, that is a recipe for disaster because you have it could be as many as 100,000 Chinese students in the UK. They pay a lot of money. They work hard, um, but they're investing money here. The Chinese government, the Chinese Education Bureau is investing money here, so the universities don't want to upset them. And a side product of this is that when Chinese students behave badly, as has sometimes been reported, particularly last year, when they're bullying peers over political issues, universities go soft on them because they don't want to upset Beijing. Um, it's utterly pathetic. So in those three areas, Huawei, CGTN, and our universities, I see us as selling out to China. Now, just to be clear here, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. I am not for a second saying, oh, let's have no Chinese students. I am not saying that all Chinese students are a problem. Okay, I have nothing against those young people for the most part, with the exception of those who are behaving badly. They do pay a lot of money and they work hard, and we do have world-renowned universities. So I wouldn't say, oh, let's have no Chinese students. But I think we need to get a lot more assertive about what's going on here. And we need to frankly stop being pushed around by the Chinese embassy. I am sick and tired of their arrogant demands for apologies. We need to turn the tables and start making our own demands for apologies. What about the honour of the British nation? What about the hurt feelings of the British people? Which, of course, you know, that's not really relevant. But it would just be what I'm saying is let's start using their rhetoric. Let's think about it. Um, I don't think realistically we can simply cut off all trade and communication with China. I mean, for one thing, with coronavirus, we have to have some line of communication. We have to have mutual work on this for obvious reasons. We have British citizens in China, they've got citizens here, and so on. And there's people in mixed marriages with a Chinese spouse. So, for obvious reasons, we have to have some line of communication. But great powers can do that. They can have a rigid disagreement in one area whilst working on another. So we shouldn't back down on issues like Hong Kong or particularly when it comes to our sovereignty. I mean, I think that for too long we have frankly been frightened of offending the Chinese because we're worried about investment. And yeah, it's a lot of investment, but is it worth the price of selling out? What about our national pride? What about our honour as a nation? If Brexit's about, what was the jargon, going it alone? Um, I forget the jargon the Brexiteers use, but this is hardly a glowing example of it. Meanwhile, we have these ongoing feuds with the United States. I think with that, we should do some sort of deal. We should say to the Americans, okay, we'll pressure Prince Andrew to speak to the FBI if you hand over Anne Secoulis. It would be, I have a lot of issues with the Trump administration, but I think America and the special relationship goes beyond any one president. So I think that's something we should try and get that resolved. It makes absolutely no sense that we're having tensions with the United States whilst we're bending over backwards for China. It makes no sense. The Chinese government cannot be trusted. We can work with them where we need to, but that should be, it certainly shouldn't be under any illusions that they have anything other than their own interests at heart. The same applies to high speed too. Again, Chinese investment. I refuse to believe that China is the only option. I mean, we have the Commonwealth, we have other emerging markets. Yes, China is a major economy, but there's plenty of other countries we can be looking at that cumulatively surely would add up just as much as China on its own. I mean, there's plenty of emerging markets out there. Some of them may not have perfect human rights records, but they won't be the sort of national security issues that China poses. Um, we just need to wake up because for too long we know that Russia cannot be trusted, but for too long we've acted like, oh, we'll just negotiate with the Chinese and they'll be okay. This is a regime that's lied to its own people for 72 years. It cannot be trusted. The Chinese Communist Party survives in one thing alone, which is absolute power and lies. They cannot be trusted. So we need to know that and we need to work with it appropriately. And the more we pander to them, the more we give them what they want, the more enabled they will be. I just think it's reckless in the extreme. Of course, they'll have a tantrum if we don't give them what they want. Let them. This idea that we have no other choice is surrenderous nonsense. I really believe that. And I can see problems really developing with this further down the line. So summed up, I don't want anyone to misunderstand me. I'm no Sinophobe. I love China. I really, really do. I love China, the country. It's a country that's had a very, very influential role in my life. Um, and I am totally okay with people-to-people contact. You know, that's something that shouldn't be just dismissed. But we need to know the nature of the regime we're dealing with here. And it doesn't matter what they say, they cannot be trusted. And we need to, work with that. When it comes to something like coronavirus, let's work together. But if Liu Xiaoming tries this Western phobic shaming of, oh, it's all racism, don't overreact, we need to fire back and say, well, what about the Western phobia in Chinese state media? We take issue with that, Mr. Liu. We basically, when it comes to China, we need to stop being a pushover. We also need to remind Chinese nationals that they're guests, and because sometimes one of the main, this is another thing that unfortunately can't be ignored. Um, Whilst there are brave Chinese citizens like the people I named, there are also some Chinese citizens who push the propaganda of the regime, and they do have arrogance themselves. They think they can come to other countries and promote not necessarily the Communist Party, but oh, China is great and China can't be questioned. And they need to remember they're guests and they need to be reminded of that fact. In other words, yes, you're welcome here as tourists, as business people, as students. We'll give you the rights that you have as guests, but respect the host nation.